Moines Storytellers Project. Thank you so much for being here to celebrate a night of live storytelling with us. We are now on a 2-show streak, which is more than we can say for 2020. We are so happy to be here at the beautiful Hoyt Sherman Place. My name is Andrea Sahori, the social justice reporter for the Des Moines Register.
Hello. And I'm Kim Norvell, a business reporter and the director of content for the Storytellers Project. Our first storyteller tonight is Blake Carlson, who will share about the lessons he learned from his grandmother.
If by chance you found yourself in Spencer, Iowa, on a Saturday night in about 1982, you might stumble upon a brown Monte Carlo amongst the cars scooping the loop on Grand Avenue. But this car wasn't full of teenagers. No, this car was full of women, or shall we say, queens, in their early 40s, and the one in the driver's seat was my grandma. They were probably on their way to snoop on the call they'd just heard on the police scanner, and that was after Grandma had glued her tip money to the bar top at happy hour, laughing as the waitress tried to peel it off. But the best was at the end of the night, calling for a ride home and greeting the person on the other end of the line with, "Did I dance on any tables? Did I shoot out any lights? Jose Cuervo, you are a friend of mine." My grandma never really grew up. She moved from her parents' house to her husband's house. The first day she lived alone was the day she got divorced. She was a free spirit, and people in a small town really didn't know what to do with that. Now, I wouldn't come along until 1998. I have a few cousins who are older than me, but being about 12 years younger, I quickly became the favorite grandchild. Grandma traded her brown Monte Carlo for a purple Cavalier and traded scooping the loop for the kindergarten pickup line. Instead of her girlfriends in the car, it was little old me peering over the dashboard. Late nights at the Eagles Club became Friday nights in the Walmart clearance section, with me, about 4 feet tall, in her shadow, hauling her 20-pound oxygen tank on what was, for her, a leisurely stroll, and for me, an Olympic heavyweight competition in front of the $1.99 Tupperware. Little did I know that these excursions would prepare me for life in the real world. My grandma was tough. Her husband was an alcoholic, and she had a few vices herself. She started carrying that oxygen tank at just 58 years old. Part of carrying on the way she did was having as much confidence in the bad times as in the good times. She passed that mentality on to me. Around the time I was born, I experienced a pediatric stroke. Everyday activities like getting dressed, brushing my teeth, tying my shoes, eating, writing, and typing all had to be adapted because my right hand and fingers don't have quite the motor function I need to complete these tasks. Therapy has been part of my routine practically since the day I was born. And while hauling Grandma's oxygen tank on a funeral dirge through the aisles of Walmart did work my grip strength, it was her outlook that was healing for my young soul. I learned not to use my stroke as a crutch, which meant figuring out how to adapt to any situation before asking for help. Do y'all remember the classroom pencil sharpener? Now, I don't know if you noticed, but the sharpening handle is always on the right side, which meant for me crossing my arms, holding the pencil in my right hand and twisting the sharpening handle with my left hand without looking like a contortionist in the middle of my 5th grade math test. It was in these moments I remembered my grandma. Confidence is key in the good times and the bad. She never really had a profound way with words about how to get by. It was more of just her sitting in her large floral armchair looking at me saying, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" And it was at that moment when my emotionally frustrated young mind usually grabbed her oxygen cord and squeezed it as hard as I could, just to see if she noticed. And usually she did. When I got to middle school, I began to come to terms with something else. I'm gay. A fact I buried deep inside, living in silent anguish as I navigated life at the intersection of my two identities. I hadn't mustered the courage to tell my friends I was gay, and I hadn't told my grandma either. In high school, Grandma became disoriented as her health slowly declined. I was now helping take care of her. But what neither of us realized is that she was still helping take care of me, too. Being different wasn't something you did in a small town, and being with my grandma gave me a sense of confidence and comfort I needed. I'd spent my entire life adapting to my stroke. I should have been able to handle coming out, too. This wasn't so easy. Grandma's spirit and light slowly faded, but she kept an ounce of the good times through her final days. There was one hospital room near the nurses' station that had this large window in it so they could monitor her. But she was really the one monitoring them. You see, Grandma was convinced that the staff wasn't paying quite enough attention to her. So she flipped the bird to every nurse, doctor, and aide who walked by until finally somebody stopped to say, "Is everything all right?" To which she would so innocently respond, "Why, yes, I'm fine," only to continue giving them the finger after they left. She died peacefully in her sleep, though I think she would have preferred to make more of an exit. She never did know I was gay, but I also never had a girlfriend the entire time she was alive, so I think she might have guessed. I'm not sure what she would have said if I'd come out, but I think it might have been something to the tune of, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" When we were picking out her gravestone, we tried to capture her memory the same way she ended each night way back when, with Jose Cuervo. Grandma's infamous phone call lyrics are etched in stone for eternity. Did I dance on any tables? Did I shoot out any lights? Jose Cuervo, you are a friend of mine. In the years since her passing, I've had a chance to reflect on our relationship. For the longest time, I was trapped into this idea of who I should be and not who I am. It's been a long road to get here, but I stand before you tonight as an out and proud queer person and a fierce advocate for the disability community. Thanks. I got this tattoo on my arm last year in remembrance of her. It's a woman holding a suitcase standing against some faded flowers. It's based on Tanya Tucker's Delta Dawn, a song that reminds me of growing up with my grandma. The songwriter said that it was as if his mother had always walked around as if she had a suitcase in her hand with no place to put it down. I can't think of a more accurate description of my grandma. It serves as my reminder to always keep her spirit and have confidence when the good times turn bad. Linda Carlson was born August 5th, 1943. She died September 24th, 2015. She was one of the toughest and the funniest people I've ever known. But more than anything, she taught me to have the audacity to stick out in this world, to be authentically and relentlessly me. Thank you.
Thank you, Blake. We're sure your grandmother would be really proud of you right now. Next, we'll introduce Jeff Clothier, who has a story about growing up after his senior year prom.
You know, this growing up business has some milestones to it, like your first real relationship, your first significant other, your first love. Well, mine was Kelly, my high school girlfriend. Lovely girl. Long, wavy blonde hair, great smile, smart, funny, talented. Dumped me 3 weeks before prom and insisted I take her anyway. But I'm not bitter. Now. But you see, in Harlan, Iowa in 1980, and 81, prom was a big deal. I, unfortunately, was not. I was it's true, I was a musician in primarily a jock school. And so I had some credibility in the music wing and then almost nowhere else. But I had Kelly. We first met in junior high school. I was in 8th grade, she was in 7th, and I was immediately smitten. And from there, it just kind of grew organically. We were in vocal music together. We were in show choir. We were in a touring gospel group for a number of years. And same group of friends, great friends with my sister. It was just meant to be. And then the end of March, early April in 1980, we're all getting excited for prom, when a group of Kelly's friends came to me in a delegation. You know what I mean? That's when your girlfriend's girlfriends come to you with bad news about your girlfriend. Now, this has happened to me more than once, so trust me, it's a thing. And they had me cornered in the little corridor between the vocal and the band room 5 minutes before first period band. Now, I can't remember exactly who, and I can't remember exactly how many. So I'll just invite you to imagine them as I do. A group of high school girls with deliciously bad news to share, speaking in unison, kind of like a Greek chorus. Jeff, Kelly has something she needs to talk to you about right away. She's waiting for you in a practice room, and we think you should go to her now. Brilliant public speaker, I replied, what? Jeff, Kelly's waiting for you in a practice room. She really needs to talk to you, and we think you should go to her. Talk to me about what? Just go. And I turned around and went back down the corridor of practice room to practice room until I found her, sitting on a piano bench, her head down, blonde hair framing her face. And I stepped in the room, and she immediately looked up at me with the same expression as her delegation. And I said, what's up, Kel? She goes, Jeff, I think we need to break up. I'm like, what? You're kidding. And immediately the dam burst, the waterworks commenced, and she launched into a tearful but clearly well-rehearsed spiel about how I was going to graduate and she'd be left behind. I was going to Luther. We'd both meet other people and probably should. I did not see this coming in any way, shape, or form. I was gobsmacked. I was gut shot. You could have smacked me in the back of the head with a 2x4, and I would not have felt it. And it did not feel real to me until we did the breakup hug. At which point, my only mission in life was to get out of that little room with some shred of my dignity intact. But as I turned to go, she said something to me that was like a little ray of hope, just a little sliver of sunshine for a moment. And then it just turned icky. She said, but we're still going to prom, right? At this point, my lizard brain clicked in, and I said something like, yeah, it's 3 weeks to prom. What else are we going to do? Sure, we'll go. And then I left the room. But I remember thinking, but you might live to regret it. So I went through the rest of the day in a daze, and at some point during the day, another friend of Kelly's, who was not a member of the delegation, informed me that the real reason Kelly was breaking up with me was so she could go to the Urbandale prom the following weekend with a guy she'd met in Methodist confirmation camp who had a car. Which I did not. Urbandale? Now, see, to Harlan kids in 1980, Urbandale kids were all rich, drove Aston Martins, and wore ascots to school. Urbandale. So with this little tidbit of information under my belt, I went to find my buddy Gary, who it turns out was also having problems with his girlfriend, Deb, also stuck in a promise to take her to prom anyway. And so our evil scheme was hatched. Sure, we'd take the girls to prom. Of course, we would fulfill our promises, but we'd make sure they had the most miserable time of their lives. And we did, too. Now, prom goes like this, starts with the prom dinner. Now, my parents, who had no idea about the breakup, had offered to host a nice dinner at home for Kelly and I, my sister Jenny, and her date. It was awkward as hell. Perfect for my purposes. But it was at the dance, the prom itself, that our evil scheme really took shape. Gary and I, we refused to dance. We were loud, rude, obnoxious. If there had been lampshades anywhere in the room, they'd have been on our heads. And when the girls retreated to the bathroom to cry, we staged a fight. Now, Gary was a little drunk. I faked it. Girls were mortified. We were triumphant. Somehow we made it through the whole evening, all the way to the closing ceremonies, the prom breakfast. This was at Deb's house. For Gary and Deb, Kelly and I, two other couples, also friends. Turned out nobody had had a good time that night. We weren't speaking to one another. We glared at one another. Across that dining room table, the atmosphere as cold and thick as that untouched egg casserole. Deb's mom was not a good cook. But conveniently, Kelly and Deb were next door neighbors, and so my goodnight to Kelly, my goodbye to Kelly was short, cool, kind of robotic. I might have shaken her hand, I don't remember. And that was it. I had set out to be a complete and utter jerk to that girl the entire evening. Mission accomplished. But I was young, I was in love, and I was terribly, terribly hurt. And I nursed that hurt for years. But then somewhere around the turn of the millennium, something cool happened. Kelly and I became friends again. We ran into each other at an event at our old high school, sat down on the bleachers to talk. And among other things, I told her that I had told this story many times before. Won awards for it, as a matter of fact. And she laughed. And suddenly, after 20 years, there we were again, Kelly and Jeff. And now we like each other's stuff on Facebook. She came to my dad's funeral August of last year, and it was so great to see her there, so touched, along with our other good friend, Christy. It was great to see them both. Both myself, my sister Jenny, and our mom, so touched. And she met my wife, Jill, and suddenly it occurred to me, my goodness, those two shared many of the same qualities. Could it have taken me a Kelly to get me to a Jill? And of course, we sat down and talked a little bit about our families and our daughters and our dads. And when the time came to go, we hugged. And it was nothing like the breakup hug. And she said, "Love you, Jeffy." I said, "Love you, Kel." And we both knew exactly what we meant. You know, that first real relationship is the one by which all others are judged. And I had dragged a big old bag of resentment for that breakup around with me for years, blaming Kelly all that time for the weight. Never once did I consider what she must have felt or what she must have gone through. But I'm a human being, and we do that. Yeah? But you know, I don't think I matured. I don't think I really grew up at all till I realized that I could take all that gnarly old baggage from my past, the hurts, the resentments, the breakups, the divorces. Take all that gnarly old baggage, just put it down and walk away from it. But you know what I learned is when you do that, you better remember where you put it. Because inside that baggage, the good stuff's still in there. You know, the people, the relationships, the friends, the fun, the love. It's all still in there, waiting. Waiting for a mindful moment when you can take it out and look at it all with fresh eyes and appreciate it for what it was, when it was. And that's the stuff you want to carry around with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. We're so happy to hear you and Kelly rekindled a friendship. Next, we have Jim Ramm, who shares with us a little bit of his family history.
I'm a young boy wading knee-deep in a lake on a sunny day with the breeze blowing through the mulberry trees. My grandmother sits nearby, dressed impeccably in summer-colored clothes, sewn herself, wearing a straw hat and big sunglasses, and smiling when I look at her. My grandmother and I are from different worlds. She, an immigrant from Hiroshima, me, a half-Asian boy growing up in the Midwest. She doesn't speak English, but it doesn't matter. There are big carp on the stringer, and my heart is full. Beautiful days like this were a bright spot in stark contrast to my everyday cultural experiences growing up. I was born in 1966 when there were few Asians living in the Midwest. I never heard anything positive about being Japanese. In fact, most of what I heard was negative. Kids in grade school chant, Chinese, Japanese, Nipponese, look at these. I'd get in fights in the neighborhood and at camp, and baseball teammates calling my brother and I rice bowl and chopsticks. And Pearl Harbor Day, Sister Bernadette, vehement in recalling the treachery of the Japanese people who killed her brother on December 7th, 1941, as I sank underneath my desk. I never saw other Japanese except a few times a year when Mr. Aki sold fresh fish from the back of a cold storage warehouse in Omaha. There were tables set up with beautiful fresh fish from the Pacific on beds of ice, and arriving on that day, everyone was Japanese, speaking Japanese, happily greeting my mother and grandmother. Mr. Aki, in apron, greeting us and cutting and weighing from the giant tuna. These were days of celebration and joy, punctuated by a delicious lunch of sashimi, crab, rice, and all the fixings. I left those fish sales with so much joy. But the reality was I had already grown to mistrust anybody who couldn't see the goodness of my mother and grandmother, who were both beautiful and Japanese. Outside of these celebrations, my family never really talked about being Japanese. We didn't celebrate the culture and customs on a regular basis. I didn't ask. It didn't seem like a question I could ask. I responded internally by becoming resentful and determined to outdo the non-target group, who to me at that time in North Omaha was anybody who lived west of 52nd Street. And without ever agreeing to it, I adopted an enculturating belief that there was something wrong with being me. But I love my mother and grandmother, And as a kid, I couldn't reconcile that with the message that there's something wrong with being Japanese. My grandmother immigrated to the United States from Hiroshima as a 19-year-old passage-paid picture bride. My grandfather was born in Vancouver and spoke both Japanese and English. They settled in Woodinville, Washington. There's a story about my grandfather going to meet my grandmother for the first time. And he recalls with joy when he saw this beautiful, bright red tomato coming off of the boat. They truck farmed in Woodinville, Washington. They sold produce locally, and they sold produce to the vendors who had at the Pike's Place market. My mother remembers good times in Woodinville. Her father catching fish in the surrounding streams, a dog, chickens in the yard. My grandfather had worked in the logging industry in the Pacific Northwest, and he had saved enough money to get married, to pay for that passage, and to buy a truck. My mom was 6 years old when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and that eventually led to the relocation of her family to Tule Lake internment camp in Northern California. My mom has always chosen not to talk about the internment camps. She says she doesn't want to talk about the bad things. She has told me good things about farm neighbors who were poor and white, who went to town and bought her family a gift of cardboard suitcases to help in the relocation. A soldier on the train who was kind, who smiled to her, gave her a stick of gum. She remembers details like from Tule Lake, partition walls that didn't reach the floor, the desert dust, my grandmother always sweeping, and those cardboard suitcases stowed beneath the cots. My grandmother carried with her photos of her two handsome brothers in their Japanese Navy outfits, uniforms, who both died in the war. My grandmother carried pictures of her mother and father who were killed when the United States dropped the first bomb on Hiroshima. With her family of origin dead from the war, my grandmother carried their legacy, and she poured it into her daughter. Later, the family relocated to Omaha, Nebraska, sponsored by the Catholic Church, who put my mother all the way through Creighton University Nursing School. My grandmother was a seamstress, a gardener, practiced acupuncture. My mother and father were married in Council Bluffs, Iowa, when interracial marriage was still illegal in Nebraska. They had 7 children. I was the youngest. I never knew my grandfather. I do know that he worked as a waiter in downtown Omaha at King Fong's Chinese restaurant when they moved to Omaha. From what I've heard, he was a funny guy who liked to laugh and smoke and drink and go to the races. There were stories about when the priest would come by the house to check on the sponsee family, and he'd always say to him, "I'll be there next Sunday for sure, Padre." I'll be there. But he never showed up, and he never worried about it. He lost a leg from diabetes and drinking and died before I was born. In 1990, the United States paid my mother and grandmother $20,000 each in redress for the internment. They appreciated it, but it didn't do much for me. On the outside, I was doing well, but on the inside, that enculturating belief from my childhood and resentment were leading me into deeper resentment and alcoholism. Like my grandfather before me, I developed a drinking story of my own. Life and drinking got more and more grim. And I ended up living in a guy's basement in North Minneapolis. One fateful night, I was brought to my knees, asking for help from a higher power I didn't know. And he came, and he changed my life in profound ways. Since that night, I've never had another drink. It's been 28 years. I was helped by the recovery community and a reluctant mentor who taught me so much about life. Larry was perfect. Once stationed in the Navy in Japan, he was always telling stupid Asian jokes and teaching me not to take myself so seriously. He taught me how to forgive and remove resentments. He taught me that resentment was holding on and forgiving was letting go. Eventually, I recognized that I was the one holding on to these old stories, and I had to let them go if I wanted something better in my life. Today, my dead grandfather and I are at peace. I've visited that Woodinville farm with my mother. I've walked the streets of Tokyo, celebrating the summer holiday. I've meditated with the Buddhists. And with the help of other men, I've bucketed out most of that unsaid, enculturating belief I called dirty jab. Today, my family and I celebrate who we are. On a recent Sunday, my mom comes for a visit to the house I share with my wife, Stephanie. When my mom arrives, there's always an entourage of sisters, brothers, grandkids, 3 generations of my family. There are poems, prayers, and the practice of looking into each person's eyes, happy to be together. Today is a special day. My mother has made my daughters gifts of traditional shishiko quilts with designs and stories hand-stitched into each square. We celebrate with a lunch of sashimi, crab, rice, and all the fixings, just like the days of Mr. Aki's fish market. I remember times like these, and my grandmother sitting nearby at that fishing lake when I seek an everyday calmness in my life. They are a reminder of the life my family stitched together. Despite all the hardships of coming to this country and the adversity that they faced, a reminder of their example that forgiveness is the most powerful word in the English language. And sometimes it tells a generational story. That lunch lasted 5 hours. Saying goodbye, my mom stops at the door and puts her hand on my arm and looks at me without saying anything. I can see her now. She knows I know my family story. She knows I know who I am.
Our next storyteller is Aymi Paradise-Flores, who will tell us what it's like to be the only female wrestler in her small Iowa high school.
The first thing you learn is how to fall. While most kindergartners were learning how to write their names, I was learning judo from my second-degree black belt sensei of a dad at a studio in Fort Dodge. So I practiced falling again and again and again. I would curve my shoulders like a roly-poly, tuck my chin, spread my arms like an eagle, and drop down and fall and slap the mat. Slapping the mat was important, my dad said, because it absorbs the force of the fall. I was excited to be like him. He always called me his #1 son, and I had cowboy boots and a 1980s glitter shine shirt that said so in cursive. Some of my earliest memories were him competing in area judo tournaments and earning a basement full of trophies. But then we moved to Humboldt, Iowa, and the studio lesson stopped, but never the learning. One of my dad's favorite teachable moments was to single leg sweep somebody as they're walking by and still hold onto their shoulder so they wouldn't have a hard fall. And a judo move called osotogari. It was warped, but it was normal in our house. And to this day, osotogari is still my favorite judo move. Then fast forward to the late 80s, and I'm gonna start 7th grade at Ballard Junior High, not middle school, in Huxley. Huxley is a conservative small town in the middle of a trio of other small towns, Slater, Kelly, Cambridge, in between Ames and Ankeny, that make up the Ballard School District. In the early 90s, Huxley probably had about 2,500 people, mostly of Norwegian descent, and it was still safe enough to ride bikes to and from school. We practiced typewriting on typewriters with plywood boxes over our hands for key memorization. Mixtapes were actually cassette tapes, most of the time recorded off the night's top 10 on the radio. McDonald's still served burgers in styrofoam containers and drinks in plastic-coated paper cups. So in 7th grade, I started falling into some unhealthy habits. I would come home, eat, sleep, repeat. And I was noticing this anger streak starting to build up, also like my dad. Judo was his anger management, and it became mine as well. After judo, I was just exhausted, and I was too tired to argue, just like my dad said. I begged him to get back into judo, so we went to the Iowa State Judo Club with Master Puck, and I was 13, so there was nobody really within a decade of my age except Jen. And so, the only female within a decade of my age. And so she taught me how to choke, how to do arm bars, and how to win against judoka older, heavier, and wiser than me. In fact, that year I won gold at the Iowa Games in the summer of '88, and so did my dad. Fast forward to 1990-91, I'm in 9th grade now, entering high school at Ballard, and we haven't been practicing judo. Dad got busy, but then I found wrestling in 10th grade, and I thought, this is gonna be perfect. The only problem was, not only was there no girls wrestling team, there were no girls wrestling at all. There were only 2 other girls, even in the state, who were wrestling, and there had never been a female wrestler at Ballard ever, until now. So I decided to join the Ballard boys wrestling team, and because of Title IX, they couldn't deny me. So my dad had a conversation with the principal and coaches. They were worried I would get hurt. My dad wasn't. He's like, no, she's kind of a tomboy, and she actually broke a tooth at recess in 6th grade playing football and kept on going. She'll be fine. But they said I needed to work just as hard as the guys. So I did. My dad had really idealistic thoughts about how this was gonna go. He felt the community was really supportive. And they were just really curious about a girl wanting to wrestle. But reality was a little different. So I remember my first pin in practice. Now, I'd been at practice every day for months, running 3-round flights of stairs, conditioning, lifting weights. My legs were as strong as the guys. And so my wrestling partner that day really thought it was his lucky day to wrestle the girl and the girl with big tits. So, well, he was focusing on the wrong kind of moves. I was focusing on winning wrestling moves. I remember standing position, tried to pick the ankle, no good. Double leg takedown, But then I dove in for the fireman's carry, and I lifted him in an arch over my shoulders and onto the ground in slow motion, and I rocked those shoulders into a pin. In judo, this would have been scored ippon, the perfectly executed winning throw. But the next day, he told people that he felt me up, and that's why he let me win. So this dude couldn't even have a girl beat him in practice. But I did have several allies on the team. Head coach Larry Jackson, who is still coaching to this day here in Des Moines, praised the technicality of my every move. My normal wrestling partner, Mark Hernandez, and a younger teammate, Forrest Mahaffey. But there were still too many times that I took the forfeit because somebody didn't want to wrestle a girl. My teammates ignored me in practice, except for when my hair was on the mat. I dressed in the cheerleading with the cheerleaders in the girls' dressing room, and I rode to and from away games in the front of the bus alone. And there were people still in conservative Huxley who didn't think I should be wrestling at all. And there was a lot of speculation and innuendo about wrestling me, especially at at Huxley in high school. And my dad even lost his deaconship at Campus Baptist Church because of my choice to wrestle boys. And some of his longtime friends denounced the immorality of him letting me wrestle boys. So some people thought I was out for attention or for the media, for the show of it. Nobody goes out for wrestling for the show. There was a giant above the fold picture of me wrestling a dummy, one of the wrestling dummies, in a story in the Tri-County Times. But I wasn't out for that. That wasn't me. I was out to prove to myself that I could do this, to push the limits where even I didn't know if I could succeed. And the more people didn't want me there, the more I wanted to be there. And I started to realize now that I paved the way for future generations of girls in Iowa's male-dominated wrestling world, including my younger sister, Katie, who wrestled the Ballard boys team just a few short years after I did. The discrimination is still very real. But I realized that I helped pave that way, and that the way for girls to have their own wrestling teams, for girls to earn wrestling scholarships, girls to have a fair fight, because I never did. I lost a lot all the time. I kept falling and falling and falling some more. I never won a match. I never wrestled a girl, but I wrestled. And I celebrated the small successes, because that's all there was. So today, when I tell people that I was Ballard's first female wrestler, I focus on the lessons I learned, the ways in which I took straw and spun it into gold. Out of this lonely, alienated, and ostracized place, I learned a path forward with coping mechanisms and how to take that anger and depression and loneliness and turn it into something more, into empathy, resilience. And those skills have been my superpower that followed me from a humid Huxley wrestling room to Houston, Texas, and back. And that feeling of being ostracized helps me connect and teach my students at Hoover High School's Flex Academy. And like my dad, I became optimistic that I could weather any storm. Fast forward to 2022, and I was watching March Madness with my daughter, 7-year-old, and she asked me, we kept switching between the men's and the women's games, and she's like, why can't boys and girls just play on the same team, the way she does with her Cub Scout den. And I still have no answer for her. But I do know this. 2 weeks ago yesterday, Ballard voted to have its first female wrestling team at high school next year. And my daughter will continue to pave the way forward for females in sports in Iowa. This is the first time in 30 years that I've told this story. I've spent decades burying the trauma and hiding from that identity my whole adult life. And I even changed my name. My name is Aymi Fell, F as in fish, O-E-L-L, pronounced Fell. Yes, the past tense of fall. And I am Ballard's first female wrestler, one of the first in the state, and this is my story. Thank you.
Thank you, Aymi, for paving the way for women's wrestling in Iowa. Our last storyteller tonight is Tony Dahlman, who will tell us a story about receiving strange calls when he was a young child.
I looked down at the caller ID on my cell phone, and I knew immediately that it was Saddam Hussein. I was walking down the sidewalk in Washington, D.C. with my cousin Beth and her husband, Dan. They had just taken me out for supper at a local bar and trivia night. And our trivia team, happy 27th birthday, Tony, had just taken second place. Now, normally, my wife, Carla, would be responsible for taking me out for my birthday dinner. But she was overseas for work in Afghanistan, and the rest of my family was back home in Minnesota. So Beth and Dan stepped up to the plate, because that's just the way our family is. I was looking at my buzzing cell phone, and I muttered to myself, "Oh, that must be Saddam Hussein." Dan had an extremely confused look on his face. So I explained, "Yeah, every year Saddam Hussein calls me on my birthday." That explanation did nothing to alleviate the confusion on Dan's face. So I explained a little bit further. It goes back to my 7th birthday. I was sitting at the kitchen table of my parents' house, and I was reading the newspaper. Because even at the age of 7, I was one of those nerdy kids who liked the news and politics. And I saw a story that reminded me of a conversation that I had with my Uncle Mark. Now, I grew up with a really close family. My dad had 8 siblings. Of those 8 siblings, 4 of them lived within a 5-mile radius of the farm that I grew up on in central Minnesota. My Uncle Mark was the only one of those siblings who did not get married and have kids of his own. But he made up for it by paying a lot of attention to his nieces and nephews. Uncle Mark and I would talk about the news of the day, and the major news story in 1991 was the Persian Gulf War in Iraq. My Uncle Mark had told me that the United States and Iraq had come to a peace agreement. In exchange for disarmament and peace in the Middle East, U.S. President George H.W. Bush agreed to give Iraqi President Saddam Hussein the calendar date of March 13th. Now, never mind the logistics of the international transfer of a calendar date. I was more concerned because March 13th is my birthday. And there is nothing more important to a 7-year-old boy than his birthday. And that's when my mom told me that I had a phone call. I heard a loud, booming voice over the receiver. "Hello, Antonio! This is Saddam Hussein." Now, to this day, I have no idea what an Iraqi accent sounds like. But this half Italian, half Scandinavian voice continued over the phone. "Oh, Antonio, I just wanted to call you and tell you that I am going to take good care of your birthday, and I hope that you have a very good year." Saddam called again on my 8th birthday. He called again on my 9th birthday. He continued to call me all throughout middle school. He continued to call me all throughout high school. He continued to call me long after we all got caller ID. And I was well aware of the 320 area code phone number that all of these phone calls were coming from. On my 19th birthday, Saddam was all concerned about this new Bush in the White House. And he was hoping that I would go to Washington, D.C. as one of his dear and only friends and attempt to convince President George W. Bush to not invade his country. On my 20th birthday, Saddam called and told me not to worry, that even though he had been captured in an Iraqi foxhole by American forces, that he was still going to take good care of March 13th. It was my 23rd birthday, and I was sitting at my kitchen table at my apartment in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and I was reading the newspaper. And I was thinking about the news events that had transpired over the last few months. In December, Saddam Hussein was brought before an Iraqi war tribunal for crimes against humanity. He was found guilty and he was sentenced to death. Within a few hours, pictures had leaked to the American media of a hanging. Saddam Hussein was dead. And that's when I saw the 320 area code phone number on my cell phone. "Hello? This is Special Agent Jones. Is this Anthony Dahlman?" "Yeah, this is him." "I have a personal call from an S. Hussein. Do you accept?" "Absolutely, I do." "Mr. Hussein, you have 60 seconds. "Hello, Antonio!" "Wow, Saddam, I really didn't expect to hear from you." It's like, "Oh, Antonio, I would never miss your birthday." "Saddam, I hate to ask this, but where are you?" "Oh, Antonio, I am on a secret island with Jimmy Hoffa and Jack Kennedy." "Wow, Saddam, that's really interesting." He said, "Oh, Antonio, I don't have a lot of time. I just wanted to thank you for being my dear and only friend, and I wanted to call you and wish you a happy birthday." "Mr. Hussein, your time has expired." Click. So there I was on the sidewalk in Washington, D.C., attempting to explain to Dan how I have received a birthday phone call every year from the age of 7 from Saddam Hussein. The look of confusion on Dan's face turned into something else. He just had one reaction. "That is really weird." And for the first time, I realized this is really weird. Saddam Hussein was an awful man. He invaded another country. He gassed his own people. And my Uncle Mark has been pretending to be him for the better part of a quarter century, to call me up and wish me a happy birthday. But my cousin Beth, who was well aware of the antics of the Dahlman uncles, just shrugged her shoulders and said, "That's just the way our family is." And also, for the first time, I realized what isn't weird is growing up with a family who really cares about you. My Uncle Mark paid a lot of attention to his nieces and nephews. And while to this day, he still denies any knowledge of the origins of the birthday phone calls that I get from dead Iraqi dictators, he was the guy who came and watched my football games in high school. Even when I moved away from Minnesota for work, when I come home to visit family, he still takes the time to come and visit with me. And when I was a kid, he paid close attention to my interests and came up with a story that made a 7-year-old boy feel special on his birthday. A little over 2.5 years ago, my sister had her first child, a little girl named Hannah. About 6 weeks ago, my sister had her second child, a little boy named Zach. I tried to pay a lot of attention to my nieces and nephews. I have this game that I play with Hannah that I call Jump, where I get up behind her, I put my hands around her waist, and I say, "Hannah, it's time to jump. We have to count to 3. 1, 2, 3. And then we fly across the living room while she laughs and giggles. I am going to pay close attention to the interests of Hannah and Zach, because I know that one day they are going to find their Saddam Hussein. Because that's just the way our family is.